So my PSIO cartridge has arrived. I ordered this back at the beginning of March and it's just arrived towards the end of June. Now, the makers of this cartridge, what they do is as they get orders, they make cartridges, because otherwise if they made a batch load of these and didn't sell them, it wouldn't be particularly good. Essentially what this is a flash cartridge for the Sony PlayStation. You can see I've got a couple of flash carts here for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Mega Drive, SD2 snares and the EverDrive MD. And the concept is the same for the PSIO. You've got your game ROMs. In the case of the PSIO, it would be CD images, ISO images on the SD card, as well as the system software for the cartridge itself. And you pop that into the cart and you plug that into the console and away you go. Essentially, you'll get a lovely menu system where you can select a game and you can play the game. Now, with these cartridges, it's really awesome because you can play virtually any game from that particular system's library, including games from other regions, which again I think is pretty neat. And the PSIO is a very, very similar concept, with the exception of the fact that, of course, this machine uses CDs as opposed to cartridges, whereas things like the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo, they use cartridges, they didn't use CD-ROMs. So, the PSIO is pretty cool. So what we're going to do then, we'll get my PSIO cartridge, we will load on the menu system software, we'll also pop on a load of game ISOs, plug this into the back of the PlayStation and away we go, right? No, if only it was that simple. Before we even think about plugging this cartridge into the back of my PlayStation, there's a small manner of installing a switchboard. So essentially you have to modify your Sony PlayStation. Here actually is an SCPH 1002 motherboard out of another system that I had many, many years ago. And this particular motherboard is completely untouched. Now, there are some points, I mean, you can probably just about make out. There's some quite small points on this board that you're going to have to solder to. There's also some traces that you're going to have to cut, and they are also pretty fine traces, some pretty small ones, and solder in the switchboard. Now, this is where, for a lot of people, they're not going to want to do this because you do risk, of course, damaging the PlayStation motherboard to the point where it won't work again until you get it repaired. So this is where you may want to call on the services of somebody that is pretty good with a soldering iron and also is okay with cutting fine traces. Now, I actually did manage to do the install of my own switchboard. It's in here. I took my time. That's the best advice I can give to anybody doing this themselves. Take your time. If you've installed PlayStation mod chips before, then it's going to be a breeze up until the point when you get to scratching the traces. But I used a little X-Acto knife, and I also used a magnifier so that I could see exactly what I was doing and to make sure that I was cutting exactly what I needed to and nothing else. So once I did that, the PSIO switchboard is installed, and then you can move on to actually loading on the menu files and also the game ROMs. But again, another thing I need to mention, as you're going to see when I show you what's on my PC, what's on the SD card, PlayStation games typically, when you rip them yourself, will come in a bin and queue format. That's usually what ImageBurn does when you rip a disc, a PlayStation disc. It does it in a bin and queue format, which is fine. But for the PSIO, any games that use audio tracks, so actual CD audio tracks that you could listen to on a CD player, you need to actually convert the Q file, the .cue file, into a .cu2 file. Now there is a tool, there is a system tool that PSIO have made for this, and it allows you to convert a Q file to a CU2. It's really, really straightforward to do. It is literally just load up the CUE file when it says, save it as a CU2 file, and the job's a good one. You can also save artwork in a bitmap format. It has to be a particular dimension, 80 by 84 pixels. And that's for the artwork, for the box art for the game. As you'll see, I've actually done that for pretty much all the games that are on my PSIO cartridge. So, once you've got all that sorted and out of the way, you're good to go, right? Well, again, there is another thing you need to consider. And I've done videos on playing backups and imports on the Sony PlayStation before. If you've got games that use something called libcrypt protection, so one example I'm going to throw straight at you is Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, you're going to need to patch the ISO, the bin file of that game with a patch that removes the libcrypt protection, because as it stands, the PSIO will not work with libcrypt protected games. They won't load. Basically the same as if you copied that libcrypt protected game onto a CDR and you didn't patch the ISO or the bin file before burning it to CD, it won't work. So similar scenario, you're going to have to patch the ISOs. I think they are working on something to actually make libcrypt games work with the PSIO, but there is that particular issue as well that you may find if there's a particular game that you want to play that has libcrypt protection. So let's rig this all up. I'll show you the menu system, and yeah, I'll show you a game loading, and then I'll give you my final thoughts on the PSIO cartridge. Okay, so here we are at the PSIO main menu. You can see I've got a lovely background here of wallpaper. That's not by default, but you can use your own wallpaper. You just have to put the wallpaper.bmp file into the root of the SD card. It does need to be a particular dimension, so that's something you'll need to look at. This is one that's just called Bookshelf that I downloaded from a forum. And all you do once you've got your wallpaper file on your SD card, press triangle to go to the options screen, scroll down to where it says enable wallpaper, and set it to yes. That's essentially all you do, and then if all is well, you'll get the wallpaper applied to the background of your PSIO menu system. So what I'll do is I'll load a game that has CD audio tracks, because I mentioned earlier on about the CU2 file. This particular game has got the CU2 file created for it from the bin and Q file that it was originally in, and all I need to do is press X or cross. You can see the artwork for the game, and if I quickly press circle to view the details, can you see at the bottom there it says CU2 sheet, yes. So if I now press the cross button to play the game, and the game will now load up. Now, due to the FrameMeister, as in the capture stroke scaling device that I'm using, basically the video signal does go in and out, so we're not going to see anything until Ridge Racer is near enough loaded up. It's one of the most annoying things about the XRGB FrameMeister. And if I wait a few seconds, you should hear the main menu music playing in the background. And on Ridge Racer, those tracks are actually CD audio tracks, they're not data. So they're separate tracks. And because I've created the CU2 file, the music is playing all normally. But here you go, here is Ridge Racer. Everything is completely normal and I absolutely love it. And one of the benefits as well of PSIO is faster loading times. You do get faster loading times as well because it's using the SD card and the cartridge rather than a CD-ROM drive, rather than having any mechanical moving parts. So here we go, I can sit here and enjoy Ridge Racer all day long. It's just to give you an example of how things work. And everything plays exactly as it should. It's fantastic. Okay then, so time for me to give my final thoughts on the PSIO cartridge, to give you guys the pros and cons as I see it with this PSIO device. So, the pros are, well, essentially, this will replace your CD-ROM drive, but unlike other devices for other consoles, your CD-ROM drive is still operational, so you can still use your original PlayStation game discs to play it, and if your PlayStation does have a mod chip, it will still function as normal. It doesn't interfere with PSIO, so I think that is really awesome. Some of these other things, for like the Dreamcast and the Saturn, you have to remove the CD-ROM or the GD-ROM unit to actually use the GD-EMU or the RIA or the Phoebe device, which means then if you want to play an original game disc, you have to take that device out and put the CD-ROM or GD-ROM drive back in, which is a bit fiddly. Not the case with PSIO. The switchboard essentially determines whether it's the cartridge that's going to take preference over the CD-ROM, or within the menu you can actually put a disc in and press circle to load the CD, and it will use the CD-ROM drive instead of the cartridge. I like that. I think that's really, really cool. I like the menu system. I think it's good. There are maybe some improvements they can do to it, but it works. It's a menu system. This cartridge is not 100% compatible, though, with all games. I did mention libcrypt, which you can work around because you can actually patch the bin files of the games that may have libcrypt protection, so that's not a problem as such. But there are also some other games that don't play well, or that you may have to switch EXT DSP modes within the menu in order to get them to work. I'm hoping they change that so that you can switch EXT DSP mode just for a particular game that's having problems. For instance, the EXT DSP version 3 that's on this cartridge now by default, if I try and load, for instance, FIFA 2000, which I know nobody cares about, it will get stuck at a loading screen and won't go any further. If I then switch it to EXT DSP2, the game loads fine and plays fine. So it's not 100% compatible, so that's something that you definitely need to bear in mind. But from what I've seen, the compatibility is pretty good, and a lot of the games I've loaded on here, they work fine. I've had no issues with them whatsoever. So really the downsides are the cartridge isn't easy to get hold of. there is going to be a waiting time when you order the cartridge. So, you know, expect to wait potentially a few months, depending on how they're getting on with the orders and the manufacturing of the cartridges. My particular cartridge, on occasion, especially if I take the SD card out to put some more games on it, and I'll put the SD card back in and turn the console on, it will get stuck at the Sony screen. So I know straight away something's wrong. It'll just show the Sony logo and nothing else. It won't proceed any further. And I find that I have to keep ejecting and inserting my SD card a few times, almost as if it's not quite making a decent connection inside, and then it works fine. Then the PSIO boots and initializes and you get that boot sequence. So my cartridge, yeah, I'm a little bit unsure as to whether there's an issue with the SD card slot or whether it could just be this SD adapter, because I've got a micro SD card in there that could be causing issues. Not entirely sure. And I suppose lastly, and this originally was a deal breaker for me, the fact you have to install the switchboard into the machine. That's not going to be for everybody. There's going to be a lot of you guys out there who don't care about soldering, or just the whole concept of soldering might worry you, scare you, concern you, and you don't want to start hacking away at your PlayStation motherboard. So that may put you off, and especially if you maybe can't get anybody else to do it for you. The actual makers of this cartridge, though, they do offer a switchboard installation service, but these guys are based in Australia. So if you're here in Europe, for instance, in the UK, you would have to send your mainboard off to them in Australia, which will get quite costly for them to do the installation for you professionally and then send it back. So, but personally, I'm not the best at soldering. Yes, in recent times, I've happened to install mod chips and also rework existing mod chip installs in other motherboards that I've picked up, other machines I've picked up. So I was pretty happy with the PlayStation motherboard, the smaller points you'd have to solder to, but I appreciate not everybody would be. So that could also be another sticking point. But guys, I really, really like this device and I highly recommend it. I like the fact that you can still use original discs if you want to, but this, especially as time goes on and they continue to release software updates for it, will only get better, will only get more compatible, and more games will work and more features will be enabled. I really, really love it when we get modern technology to work with old technology. It's fantastic. Guys, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the PSIO cartridge. I will catch you again soon.